the new government gets started, and obviously the Constitution is just a skeleton. And many people refer to the First Federal Congress as the Second Constitutional Convention, both historians and folks at the time, and they understand how they're going to be really setting the government in motion here. And Gouverneur Morris wrote a letter to Washington in October of 1788 and trying to convince him to become president, that he should accept this. And he says, there's one thing to write a constitution, but it's a totally other thing, and also to implement and to run it when it's going. But it's another thing to get it a-going, A-G-O-I-N-G, a-going. And that's why we need you. He says, anybody can run the government once it is a-going. But to be the great charioteer and to get the 13 horses to run together is a difficult thing. Even a woman or a child could lead the government afterwards, but not in the beginning. We need you. And so that was sort of the sense that a lot of people had, that Washington was really crucial. And obviously, when you get the crises that develops in Europe, Washington is thought to be absolutely necessary as well. And he wanted to retire. He didn't want to be president in the first place. And then he wanted to serve one term, in fact had Madison write a farewell address. And then he was convinced he should stay on. Jefferson writes a wonderful letter to Washington and saying, you should not retire. I understand you've made the decision and you don't change your mind, and you've assured yourself that it's the right thing to do, but we really need you. You've got to stay on. And so he does for one more term. So Washington is critical in this whole process in setting up the government. And if you can imagine at that time the difficulties of getting the appointments. I mean, there aren't that many people to be appointed back then compared to now. The thousands of people that are in the government today. There's a handful of people back then. But still, you need to make the appointments. And Washington is very adept in making appointments. He uses advisors very well. He uses the Senate. This is sort of where we get senatorial privilege from, where senators have a great deal of authority, particularly in appointing judges, federal judges, for their state. They almost have a veto power. And that's a precedent that Washington set, because he didn't know folks. And so he would confide carefully in the Senate, and he'd give very strict and detailed instructions. You're always to, I think John would probably make a good judge. I'm not sure, but I think he would. So, Sarah, you sound him out, will you? Don't give him any promises, but tell him, what do you think about being a judge? You think you'd be able to do it? You think you'd be willing to do it with the travel and the pittance that we're going to be paying him? Then get back in touch with me. And once I got that information, I wouldn't let him know. I would just do the appointment, and he would find out when I sent him the commission. If I didn't send him the commission, he would know he didn't get the job. And if you applied for the job, basically you didn't get the job. That showed you wanted the job, and that's not a good sign. You have to be solicited, or you have to, if you do want the job, you get somebody to intervene for you and write a letter. And so if you look at the State Department records, you'll find there's a record for each president, at least for the first few. I don't know what happens after 1800. That's current events as far as I'm concerned. But the first few presidents, there's a collection, applications for office. This is a wonderful collection because often these are loaded with biographical data as to describing people's personalities or a person describing what activities they had before. often they don't go too deep, and so there's a lot of chaff, a lot of acquaintances, but occasionally there are some important things. So, for instance, we know from 2 letters that Samuel Bryan wrote to Jefferson seeking a job that he was the author of the Sentinel essays, and he was the author of the Dissent of the Minority of the Pennsylvania Convention. At the time, his father was thought to be the author, George Bryan, who's the real prominent person, but Samuel is former clerk of the Assembly, and he acknowledges he was the author of those essays. And so you do get some interesting information from that. So Washington decides pretty early that John Jay has got to be big in the new government. And Madison writes in a letter that the 2 of them met privately. And in that conversation, Madison, you have to understand, is sort of a special role. He's in the House of Representatives. The play, how many of you have seen the play, Hamilton? I think he maybe alludes, Maggie's my authority on the play. Does Miranda say that Madison was in the cabinet meeting? I think he does, and he's not, obviously. He's in essence what we would call the whip or the leader, the majority leader in the House for the first 2 years, and then he breaks away. He's not after that. But he is Washington's confidant. He would also be given a title, let's say, protocol secretary. Washington wants to know, how should I behave? What should I do? Everything is precedent setting. So it's very important. And so almost every day, 6'3.5" George Washington would go to 5'2" Madison and say, this is the problem I have. How should I handle it? And Madison would go home and work on the problem, and the next morning they come together and Madison would tell Washington what to do. What's the procedure? And so they did that for a long time. Madison is also sort of a ghostwriter for Washington. That was very disillusioning to some people, particularly John Jay. He couldn't believe that Washington had a ghostwriter. Couldn't believe that Hamilton wrote the second farewell address. It's just impossible, but so it was. Madison records that Washington met with Jay and asked Jay, what do you want? Do you want state again, since he was Secretary for Foreign Affairs? Do you want the Treasury? And Jay said, no, he would prefer Chief Justice. And so that's what he got. So that left the others open. And one of the things that Washington does is he has a whole list of maybe almost 10 criteria for office holding. And one is geography. And so the Supreme Court, you're going to have 6 justices. 2 will be from the New England states, 2 from the Middle states, and 2 from the Southern states. And the cabinet's going to be the same way. The vice president, the feeling is the vice president will come from Massachusetts. Hamilton is going to be, after Jay decides Chief Justice, Hamilton's probably number 1 on the list for the Treasury. And so who else do you get? Well, Washington's from Virginia, and he knows some Virginians very well, and so he decides maybe it's Jefferson to be Secretary of State. There are 3 great diplomats at this time. Jay is the greatest because, as I said yesterday, he dealt with the 3 major countries. But Jefferson is very good too, and Jefferson has been abroad for 5 years and has been quite effective, I would say, in France, and particularly with the aid of Lafayette. And Adams would be the other great diplomat. A lot of shortcomings with Mr. Adams as far as being a diplomat. He's got a lot of detractors. And I don't know that Washington didn't have the attitude, as many Federalists did, that that's not good enough for Adams. Adams felt he was the father of the Revolution. He should be the president. Well, you can't unseat George Washington. And so the only one he would serve under would be Washington, and that means he'll be vice president. And he would probably accept that. And the feeling was we probably should offer him that, because if we didn't offer him that, he might well be an opponent of the government. And we don't want that to happen. or he'd be put in a position that he's not effective in. And so let's hide him as vice president. Vice president doesn't do anything but serve as the president of the Senate. That's what was the duties of the vice president at the time. And in fact, the vice president wasn't viewed as a executive officer. He was viewed as a legislator. And so when Washington goes home on vacations, or when he travels in the South and the North on his tours, the North in October of '89, and 2 years later in the South, the government is put in the hands of Secretary of State. Remember General Haig, when Reagan was shot. I'm in charge, not the vice president, and that was the case back then. It was Jefferson that was in charge. And in fact, cabinet meetings were held in Jefferson's home. And if it was necessary, John Adams was invited. Not all the time. Because again, he wasn't an executive officer in the eyes of the folks at the time. Even in his own eyes, he was a legislator. So the field is narrowed down, and Jefferson is the one. Now, it just so happens that he has arranged to come home at that time, Jefferson has, from France. And this is because he has 2 daughters that survived. Jefferson and his wife had 6 children. 4 of them die early, and 2 survive. One survives Jefferson. She dies in 1836, but the other dies in 1804. When Polly dies, Jefferson says, "I've lost half of what I have, half of what I own." And he's totally distressed over the death of Polly. It's really a sad thing. It does give rise to a nice series of letters that the Adamses and Abigail and John are separated from Jefferson. You know, I always say I could never forgive Jefferson of one thing, and that is he stopped Abigail and John from writing to each other. So we have these 861 letters between John and Abigail that are wonderful letters to look at. But Jefferson said you can't write to each other anymore, and they don't. Does that surprise anybody? They had that clout. Now, how did he have the clout? He beats Adams for the presidency, and Adams and John and Abigail are never separated after that. They don't need to write to each other because they can talk to each other, and so the correspondence stops. And so I put that at Jefferson's footsteps. He's responsible for the stoppage of that wonderful correspondence that we have. But they're estranged from each other. 1801. Abigail leaves a little bit early, and John then leaves like 4 o'clock in the morning before inauguration. They never see each other again, the Adamses and Jefferson. And John Adams and Jefferson start their correspondence in January of 1812 through the good offices of Benjamin Rush. But in 1804, Abigail writes to Jefferson secretly, unbeknownst to her husband. And it's on the death of Polly. She loved Polly. She had come in contact with Polly several times, and she said in her letter, I debated with myself for a month, should I get in touch with you or not? And she finally said, yes, I have to. And there's a series of 4 letters that go between the 2 of them. They're personal at first, then they Jefferson verges off into politics. And Abigail comes back fighting and defending her husband and attacking Jefferson. But Abigail signs that first letter, one who used to call you friend. Very touching, very touching. Anyway, Jefferson is the one who's singled out, and he has decided he's coming home because his older daughter, Martha, both girls are in a convent in Paris. It's a very exclusive convent, 60 girls, 30 are of royal blood, 30 are Catholic, 30 are not Catholic. The nuns don't do any teaching. They do the menial kind of work, but they have professional educators. But Patsy decides she wants to convert to Catholicism. Well, out of the convent they come, and Jefferson decides they got to go home. Patsy's been with him ever since they went over in '84. Polly joined later when her sister died in America. Jefferson said, Polly's got to come over. And it takes 2.5 years before Jefferson's in-laws, sister-in-law and brother-in-law, arranged for Polly to come over. And so Jefferson says he has to go back, bring the girls back. But then he'll come back. I mean, he loves Paris. He loves the social life that's there. And if you look at portraits of him, he's a real dandy at that time. And he's got his salons that he'd go to, his small groups. Anyway, he has his love interest that is in London. Maria Causeway, she's come to Paris in '86. They got to know each other then. Whether they had a physical relationship, I don't know. I did a book on this, and I said at the end of the book, I hope they had a physical relationship because they certainly loved each other. But then she comes back in '87, and they're distant. One end of Paris to the other end of Paris, and they have trouble getting together. Anyway, Jefferson writes to Maria Causeway. She lives in London regularly, and she's afraid of the ocean. And he could never live in London. And so he says, I'm taking the girls home, but I'll come back. And he writes to her, and one of the most romantic sentences, I think he says, she's afraid of the ocean, as I said. When wafting on the bosom of the ocean, I shall pray it to be as calm and smooth as yours to me. I used to carry that around in my wallet all the time. Such a lovely sentiment there. But he then takes the girls home, gets home, very quick trip, 19 days on the ocean. The wind is favorable. And he gets home, and Miranda says, there's a message there. What's her name? Sally. Sally, be a dear, open it up. So that's one of the few times he mentions slavery. And I don't know that Sally opened it up, but he opened it up and he saw he was nominated and confirmed to be Secretary of State. Well, he didn't know whether he wanted the job. He wanted to go back to Paris. He had work to do there, plus he had acquaintances there. And so he plays sort of hard to get. And Washington then writes another letter to him saying, come on, you got to decide here. And Jefferson says, well, I don't know. You know, if you think I should, I guess maybe I will. And Washington gets testy with him, says, forget this beating around the bush. Tell me, do you want it or not? Do you want to go back to France? If you do, fine, I'll be happy to send you back. And Jefferson says, okay, I'll take it. But I can't come right away because my daughter is getting married, and I want to be here for that. You know how badly that could affect a young person like that if their father doesn't go to the wedding. So I have to stay for the wedding, and he does. But then he goes, and it's sort of coincidental. Madison does the same thing. When he's appointed Secretary of State, he's late getting there. Different reason. His father has just died in 1801, and he has to arrange for all the funeral. Plus, he's the executor of the estate, and the estate is a mess. His father made out the will 20 years before, and a lot has happened. People have died that were supposed to be getting things, so Madison's got to straighten all that out. And so he's not there at first. That's why it's a bit of an anomaly when it's Marbury versus Madison, because Madison wasn't the one who destroyed the commission for Marbury. It was Jefferson who destroyed the commission, and because Madison wasn't even there at the time. So Jefferson does come, but he doesn't arrive until March of 1790. The government's been operating for almost a year. The government starts to function in April of 1789. It was supposed to start March 4th, but there's not a quorum. And Washington gives his inaugural address on the 30th of April, 89. So that's when they really get busy in April. And one of the things they do is they create the different departments. And there's only 3 departments: State, Treasury, and War. There's also going to be an attorney general, but he doesn't head a Department of Justice. He's basically an advisor to the president, the legal advisor, and that's Randolph, and he stays in Virginia for a while. And then you have the Postmaster General too, which again is not a full-fledged cabinet officer yet at the time. So you have these three positions, and the Secretary of State, the Department of State, is much broader than Foreign Affairs. It would be also what we would call today as Secretary of the Interior. And it's got a broad range of duties. It's involved in copyright and patents, weights and measures. The census is under the Secretary of State. The federal capital, where that's going to be, and eventually, as you know, there's the compromise so that the capital will move to Philadelphia and stay there for 10 years and then go to Washington, D.C., this new area. And Jefferson is the most important man on the Capitol. Rival, maybe the same, maybe a little bit more for L'Enfant. But Jefferson hires L'Enfant, Pierre Charles L'Enfant, to be the architect. And he has his assistants. I was in a cab once in Washington, D.C., a black driver, and we were chatting a little bit, and I was a historian. I told him, and I said, well, do you know about Benjamin Banneker? He designed this Capitol. Well, Benjamin Banneker was employed by L'Enfant. He wasn't the head architect, but he was a black free man, so from Maryland he was. But Jefferson is intimately involved in the design of Washington, and the fact that so many of the buildings there have a classical architectural design, that's Jefferson. He is the one setting out the bids for the president's mansion and the Capitol. William Thornton's bid for the Capitol is accepted. And so a lot of that kind of thing is derived from Jefferson. He's also the certifying officer for amendments to the Constitution. Now, because he wasn't there and the State Department wasn't fully functioning, Washington sends the amendments out, the first 12 amendments that go out October 2nd. Washington sends them to the states. But when Jefferson's in full operation, in 1791, for instance, he sends the amendments to Vermont. When Vermont comes in the Union in January of 1791, it's Jefferson who sends the amendments to Vermont for its ratification. And it's Jefferson that decides the amendments have been adopted. And he does so prematurely at first because he thinks, well, we've got the 3/4 of the states, although I don't have the exemplification for 2 of the states. And that's the formal document ratifying. So he asks Caleb Strong, Senator Caleb Strong from Massachusetts, where's your state exemplification? And Strong looks around and embarrassingly says, we don't have one. In both cases, Connecticut and Massachusetts, one house ratifies 10 amendments and the other house ratifies 11, and they never reconcile. And so that final document never gets sent in. I guess you could have argued that since both houses adopted 10, that those 10 were adopted, but there's no final act, and so they don't adopt. Only Georgia is the other state that doesn't ratify, and they say it's premature. And so it's in 1939 that those 3 states ratify the Bill of Rights as a obviously symbolic in this difficult world that we're living in 1939 with the fascists. President Roosevelt calls them the fascist tigers of the world. And so they ratified then. But Jefferson then has to wait until Vermont ratifies, and it becomes the 10th state to ratify. Seemingly that's 3/4, but no, now there's 14 states in the Union, so you need 11. And so they have to wait until Virginia ratifies in mid-December of 1791. And when that happens, Jefferson sends the amendments out. He's the certifying officer. Today, it's the Archivist of the United States. That's the certifying officer on amendments. Jefferson puts in a lot of time on some of these other issues, some of these non-foreign affairs issues. I should say the budget for the first Department of State is a total for everybody, $8,000, of which Jefferson gets $3,500. That's his salary. And salaries are a consequential issue here. Congress doesn't want to be too generous. Washington gets $25,000. That's salary and expenses, and there's a lot of expenses because he's expected to entertain. $25,000. John Adams, vice president, how much does he get? $5,000. The justices, they get about $3,500, I think it is, and $4,000 for the chief. District judges, they get anywhere from $800 in Rhode Island to about almost $3,000 in the largest of the states. So salaries are limited, and in fact, Congress doesn't get a salary. They get per diems, and you read the letters at the time in newspapers. They highly object to salaries. They don't want to pay people for not working. We'll pay them when they work, when they're there, but not when they're not working, when they're not in session. So the first salaries for Congress don't pass until 1816, whereupon half of the representatives are defeated for re-election because the American people are so upset with salaries. But Jefferson does have a salary of $3,500, and he's got 4 clerks working with him and 1 translator. During the interim, after the Department of State is established and Jefferson is not there, John Jay agrees to serve as acting Secretary of State, while also serving as Chief Justice. Now, he also then gets appointed, as Todd is going to tell us, as a special envoy to Great Britain. So the Chief Justice has multiple hats that he's wearing. This is true also of Marshall. John Marshall is Secretary of State and then becomes Chief Justice. But he retains the Secretary of State because he becomes Chief Justice in January of 1801. Adams only has 2 more months to serve. He's not going to find another Secretary of State in 2 months and get him appointed and in place. So he asked Marshall if he would stay on as acting Secretary of State after he's been appointed and confirmed as Chief Justice. So John Jay does that in this capacity. So he serves for a little less than a year as acting Secretary of State. Jefferson comes there finally and takes over, and he takes on these non-diplomatic issues. He establishes weights and measures. If you look at the report, I mean, it's a huge report, 25 pages or so goes on. And coinage is under the Secretary of State, not under the Treasury, which seems a little strange, but that is the case. And so he sets up the coinage for the United States. He'd already done that in the Confederation in 1784, so he was experienced at doing this. So these become important issues. But there's no doubt that the 2 most important factors that Jefferson has to relate to during his time as Secretary of State, which ends, by the way, in December of '93. He wanted to quit earlier, but he agreed to stay on. Washington asked him to stay on a little bit, so he does. But he ends in December of 1793. The 2 overriding issues are obviously the French Revolution and the American response to that, and the Hamilton Plan. And so you've got domestic issue and foreign affairs issue. And they're intertwined, as we'll see. They're not separate. Certainly a great deal of Hamilton's economic policy contingent upon good relations with the British and the constant flow of tariff revenue coming in, largely from the impost that's levied on British goods. I was looking at Jefferson's report last night. my bedtime reading on commerce, and it was interesting. $2 million worth of goods go to Spain. 4.9 million worth of American goods go to France. Over about 9.5 million goes to England. As you can see, England has twice as much American goods as France, and about 4 times as much as the Spanish. But look at the other side of the equation, and you see you got the value of American exports, and then the value of American imports. And America imports about less than $200,000 worth of goods from Spain. So put those two numbers together, and what does it give you? $2 million worth of exports to Spain and only $200,000 worth of imports from Spain. Talk about balance of trade. Tremendous balance of trade with Spain. And how is it compensated? Gold and silver. And so that's one reason why John Jay was so eager to have that Spanish treaty, that commercial treaty, to give up the right to navigate the Mississippi River, because the cash flow situation was so good with Spain. The total volume was not anywhere near the British, but the balance of trade was so favorable. And then he also explains what is being sent back and forth. I noticed the word duck didn't appear in his listing of goods that were sent from America abroad. So I don't know exactly what duck was. I presume it is sail. But he does comment on the trade, and he does say that most of the goods, American goods that are sent to England, get re-exported elsewhere. And the British merchants are making money off of that. And so instead of American merchants sending their goods to continental countries, they're going to England and then re-export it. But it's an interesting report. I didn't look at it that closely. I just looked at that table. But it would be sort of fascinating to dissect and fully appreciate what he was talking about. But commerce is an important part of the Hamilton policies, obviously, and part of Jefferson's policies. And they overlap, and consequently there is a conflict between these two men. Each side, each person and their cronies point fingers saying they're interfering. And they're both right. It depends upon you as a historian whether you're a supporter of Jefferson or Hamilton. The opponents of Jefferson have a visceral hatred for Jefferson. I don't exactly understand that, but they do. Jefferson can be two-faced, but most good politicians can be two-faced. So they really come out strongly against Jefferson. Whereas Hamilton, I think the idea is, what's new? Isn't that to be expected? I mean, you see what Hamilton does with George Beckwith. Anyone know who George Beckwith is? He is a British emissary sent by Lord Dorchester in Canada. The British have no minister in the United States. And so he serves that part. This is an embarrassing situation. When you, in the United States, sends a minister to Great Britain and they don't reciprocate, that's an embarrassing thing. And in fact, there's argument, let's pull our ministry out of St. James, bring them back. But Beckwith is there unofficially, and Hamilton decides he's going to meet with him. And the cabinet knows about this, and Hamilton reports to them. Jefferson will not meet with him. This is beneath the dignity for the Secretary of State to meet with this person who had no credentials. And Hamilton reports, and Hamilton undercuts Jefferson a lot. And so as little leverage as the United States has, that Todd talked about yesterday, has the United States, Jefferson has even less, because Hamilton is saying to Beckwith, don't worry, The United States isn't going to do that, isn't going to do this. So there's no threat that the United States has, because anything that happens in the cabinet secret, Hamilton is told Beckwith. Now Hamilton also says other things. So for instance, Washington sends Gouverneur Morris to England to be a special emissary, try to smooth things over. Hamilton, although Morris and Hamilton are pretty close together philosophically, Hamilton doesn't like this, that he's there, because I don't know exactly what he has against Morris at this time, but he meets with Beckwith, and he says, it's come to my attention that Morris is meeting with the opposition, Charles James Fox, and he's meeting with people, French, there in London, and he's carousing around. Well, he does carouse a lot, Gouverneur Morris, with his peg leg. What do you know about this, Mr. Beckwith? He said, I know nothing at all. I don't know at all. So Hamilton goes back to the cabinet meeting and reports, as he usually does, and he says, I met with Beckwith, and we discussed the fact that Gouverneur Morris is meeting with Charles James Fox and people from Spain, and he's carousing around, giving the impression that Beckwith has complained about this. And it's obviously duplicitous. And so Hamilton is doing this kind of undercutting. Julian Boyd, who's the first editor of the Jefferson papers, and obviously not an impartial observer when it comes to Hamilton, he increasingly writes longer and longer headnotes in the papers of Jefferson. They did 20 volumes. The last volume is published posthumously. But there are 55% of the volume is Boyd's notes, Boyd's annotation, not Jefferson's writings. So that has happened in the Jefferson papers through Boyd's editorship. But this is one case where Boyd did the right thing. He goes out and writes a book on what Hamilton was doing with Beckwith, and the book is called Number 7. That's the code name for Hamilton, the British code name for Hamilton, Number 7. And so if you want to see from the English point of view, written by a lover of Jefferson, the book, you can get an impression of what they thought Hamilton was doing here. But it certainly doesn't help Jefferson in his diplomatic efforts with Great Britain, the fact that Hamilton is sort of undercutting him with Beckwith. Any questions so far? Yes.
Can you just briefly describe what the Hamilton plan was?
Oh, sure. And so Hamilton has several proposals, and they're submitted at different times. The first one calls for funding of the debt. One of the surprising things is I've written a lot on New York, and I've written a biography of Governor Clinton of New York. And Clinton and Hamilton were very close friends. Clinton maybe saved Hamilton's life during the Revolution when Hamilton was sick. He brought him in, nursed him back to health. But eventually, Hamilton gets bitten by the conservative bug and he realizes that's the direction I had to go. My star is attached to Philip Schuyler, the arch enemy of George Clinton. And so Hamilton decides he's going to become an enemy of George Clinton. And so in the Clinton administration in New York, he's governor from 1777 to 1795. And then he comes back for another 3-year term later on. But during that, the 86, when every other state is experiencing the throes of depression, New York is doing very well. And the great empire state is being formed. And much of what Clinton does at the state level, Hamilton proposes to do at the federal level. The only difference is Clinton does it better in some certain regards. I mean, one of the things, Hamilton fails totally with manufacturers getting bounties. Clinton is very successful in that area. But what Hamilton proposes first is the funding of the debt. There's all kinds of debt that's out there for the United States. Securities. Quartermasters are giving securities. State governments are issuing securities. Some of these have interest payments on them. Some of them do not. Most of them have been devalued. But with the Constitution, the value of these securities goes up. And many of these securities, by this time, because the soldiers who had them and farmers who had them before, they can't afford to keep these because they're not being paid either principal or interest on this. And so they sell them on the open market at a greatly reduced cost, maybe down to a nickel on the dollar. And speculators get control of these, and the speculators at the state level often provide for the funding at full value. And that's why you get things like Shays' Rebellion occurring, because the taxes are levied to pay the state debt to speculators who purchased these for a song, and now they're being paid very much money. Anyway, Hamilton wants to fund the debt, and because it's a fiscal responsible thing to do, and it will set the government on the proper path, giving it credit. Credit is extremely important because the next war that's going to be fought is going to be fought with credit. You don't have enough money to fight a war with your own revenue. You need to borrow, and to borrow you need to have credit. And so you're looking forward here, the need not only for your present time but future financial needs. And also you want to tie the interest of the creditors to the central government. States like New York and Pennsylvania, they do the opposite. They tie the state creditors to the state, obviously. They fund the state debt, but they also start to assume the federal debt so that the people who own the federal debt are being paid state money for that federal debt, thus tying them to the states. Hamilton wants to do just the opposite. He wants to take the federal creditors and tie them to the federal government so that they'll be supportive. He also wants to emulate the British. You have a debt. Hamilton thinks a debt is a wonderful thing because it allows you that leeway, and it get involved in banking and tying the wealthy folks to the government. Look at what Great Britain did. This tiny little country, it rules the world, and it does so without particularly alienating its own population with taxes. And it's because of the bank there, the Bank of England, and the funding and the debt. All of that Hamilton has absorbed, and he wants to emulate that. Jefferson wants to pay off the debt. Many others want to pay off the debt. So that's totally contradictory from what Hamilton wants to do. So the funding happens. There's a disagreement right away. Madison wants to discriminate between who owns the debt, speculators right now, securities, and the original owners, the soldiers and the farmers who had to liquidate for a song. Madison sees the inequity of that, and he wants to be able to determine Farmer Jones should get face value 50% and the speculator 50%, or maybe even more. Whatever the speculator paid for it. If the speculator paid for a $100 note, paid $10, speculator gets $10, the original holder $90. Well, that's wonderful theoretically, but impossible practically. There's no records that tell you that. And so Madison is roundly defeated and criticized for such a ridiculous proposal, and so such a partisan thing as well. And so Hamilton's successful there. And then he provides, has a proposal for not only the bank, but also the assumption of the state debts. When the federal Constitution takes on so many tax provisions, how much money will be left for the states? The states will still have power to tax, except they can't levy import duties. But they have other methods of tax. Well, but will the people agree to pay both federal and state taxes? And if they don't agree to pay both, the federal government has the clout to demand the money, and the states maybe will disintegrate. And so Hamilton decides the federal government must take over the state debts. And so that's somewhat controversial, but because the federal government will take over the state debts of those debts that have not been paid yet. And the Southerners have paid off their debt to a great extent, or been liquidated to speculators in the North. And so if the assumption bill goes through, the Northerners are going to be very successful getting capital there, and the speculators are going to be like bandits. They're going to really reap rewards. And so the Southerners don't like this at all. Their tax money is going to be going from their coffers, their pockets, to pay the speculators up north. So that's a very controversial issue in the Hamilton plan, but it does pass. And then the bank is also quite controversial. Should you have a bank? And the big question there is necessary and proper clause. Is this a proper activity for the central government? And Washington asks his Attorney General, Randolph, and Secretary of State, Jefferson, to write an opinion. And they both write an opinion saying that the bank is unconstitutional. That there's no provision in the Constitution for a chartering of a bank. And in fact, the only time it's brought up in the Constitutional Convention, Madison knew this, Jefferson didn't, but I'm sure Madison told Jefferson, to give Congress the power to charter a bank, turned down. But that doesn't mean the same provision was, the same animosity was there at the end of the convention. As Todd said yesterday, it's an ongoing process. So the fact that they denied it, let's say in June, doesn't mean that they would have denied it again in August. But it's not in the Constitution. So Madison was assigned the task of writing a veto bill for the president. He's going to veto it, and he's in the process of writing it. And Washington asks Hamilton to defend the bank, and he does. It's a beautiful statement, but scary statement if you're on the other side. He says that the federal government should be able to do anything that is not prohibited to do, that is not immoral, and that is in pursuance of the proper aspects of government. And then 2 sentences later, he says, it's not denied that there are implied as well as express, these are the words he uses, express powers. And that the former are just as effectually delegated, these are his words, as the latter. I mean, understand what that says. The express and delegated, these are words that are loaded words. Here, he says, it's not denied that there are implied powers, and that they are, and that as well as express powers, and that the former are as effectually delegated as the latter. That is, there are implied powers. He was arguing just the opposite in the ratification debate. This is what the Anti-Federalists were arguing, that there are implied powers that will be used in all other. This is the worst nightmare of the Anti-Federalists that Hamilton is espousing. To a great extent, Hamilton wants an active federal government. I watched C-SPAN 3 on the weekend. There's a lot of history that's on there. And someone was talking about Hamilton and saying Hamilton didn't want a big government. He wanted an energetic government. Well, I think there's a great deal to be said for that. But Hamilton wanted an energetic government that would assist the wealthy. He wanted that connection. He wanted the wealthy to support the government, and the way to get the support of the wealthy is for the government to support the wealthy. And so one area where to do that was the report on manufacturers, that there would be bounties given for certain manufactured goods and agricultural goods. And that does not pass. That really calls for, again, more implied powers. That was even worse than the bank, Jefferson says. And that doesn't pass. So he's not successful there. But that's basically the Hamilton plan. And in secret, they agree upon Madison will supply some votes for the assumption to pass, and Hamilton would supply some votes for the residence bill to pass. That is, the capital would be located on the banks of the Potomac. So that is a secret dinner that Madison arranges with Jefferson and Hamilton. It's prominent in the play, and the song, The Room Where It Happened. I want to be alone in the room where it happened. That's what Burr is saying. He wants to be in that power, small group of powerful men who are making these decisions here. So that's the Hamilton plan that Jefferson is so much opposed to. And he sees that Adams and Hamilton are monarchists in his judgment. When Washington is gone. They're meeting at Jefferson's home, and they get to talk about the English Constitution. And Adams says it's the best Constitution ever written if we could only get rid of the corruption. And corruption at that time didn't mean what we think of corruption. It meant favoritism. To know the right people to get appointments. And that was what he was referring to. It's the best form of government. Hamilton then chimes in and says, I agree, the English Constitution is the best. But with the corruption. You've got to have the corruption. If you don't have the corruption, it won't work. And so Jefferson sees these men, and this is a danger, because he refers to the English Constitution for America as a halfway measure. That is, if the Republic of America fails, that's what we'll fall back to, is a limited kind of monarchy, a English-type system, which he doesn't want. He's very fearful of that. Now, at this meeting, again, Jefferson has around the room portraits. He brings a lot back from France, portraits and furniture. And he talks about portraits, and he says they're very expensive if you get the originals. He says, I don't get the originals. I go to the starving artists, and they make copies, and it's very cheap. That's what he has. And the quality is not so good either, obviously. But they're all around, and special frame over the doorway. And Hamilton says, who are these folks? And Jefferson explains. This is in his Annus. Jefferson talks about this. And he explains who these people are. And he says, over the door, 3 portraits in this frame. Locke, Newton, and Bacon, the 3 greatest men who ever lived. Who do you think is the greatest man who ever lived, Mr. Hamilton? Without hesitation, he said, Julius Caesar. Now this bothers Jefferson. and so he always thinks that Hamilton is a danger. And in fact, Jefferson writes a letter to Walter Jones, a doctor, in 1814, in which Jones asks him to describe Washington's personality. And he starts out by saying, his mind was not of the first order. He was not a Locke, Newton, or Bacon. I'm sure he would like to have had. He was not a Jefferson. He didn't have that mind, to be sure. But once he made his decision, he was sound. He never changed, and he was always right. But then toward the end, he says, Washington understood how I feared Mr. Hamilton's desire for monarchy. And he kept on saying, don't worry about it. It's not going to happen. And he said, I believe, Washington says to Jefferson, I believe that this Constitution that we're under is an experiment in a Republican form of government, and I will do everything possible. I will spend the last drop of my blood to make sure that this experiment is given a fair chance. And so he says of Washington, this is a man who for 8 years led his country in battle for independence. It was a singular kind of thing. And then for another 8 years, he led the country in the civilian government. And never once did he violate the law. Never once. So great admiration that he had for Washington. But he feared Hamilton and Hamilton's plan. But this gets translated into the foreign affairs as well. So you have, for instance, very early, the Nootka Sound incident. Anyone know about Nootka Sound? Anyone know where Nootka Sound is? British Columbia is Nootka Sound. And so you can imagine back at that time, this is 1789, 1790. The Spanish are in California, going up, and the Russians are in Alaska, coming down. And the British are sort of in between with the fur trade that's out there. And neither the Russians nor the Spanish particularly want the English there. And so there's an incident that occurs. The Spanish Navy takes over some fishing, British vessels. And it's a diplomatic incident. War is possible. And one of the things that the British want from America in this is that they can cross through American territory to go out west. They don't want to go all the way around South America. There's no Panama Canal at this time. Or, in particular, this is more likely, They want to be able to go from Canada down the Mississippi to attack New Orleans. And so the Americans divide over this. The Hamiltonians want to approve this because they want good relations with the British. The Jeffersonians, they don't want this. They're antagonistic toward the British, and not that they support the Spanish, but they support the French, and the French and the Spanish are allied in the family compact here. So that's an incident that's questionable for a while, but it's the British and the Spanish solve the problem, and it goes away. It's no longer an American problem, but that sort of sets the scene. And then you have the French Revolution going on. Joe Ernst published a book called The American Sphinx. Joe Ellis. What did I say? What? Oh, it's The American Sphinx by Joe Ellis. Joe has he's a great writer, but he has trouble with the truth. And
are you going to expound on that?
well, people might say he's a congenital liar.
You know this is going on the internet.
Well, this is a problem, and everyone acknowledged this because when he was at Mount Holyoke and he wanted to teach a course in Vietnam, and he let it be known that he went to Vietnam, and he was close advisor of General Westmoreland, and then after that he came back to the United States and got converted and was heavily involved in the peace movement here and helped to get us out of Vietnam. Well, and he wanted to teach about this at Mount Holyoke. Well, it turns out he never left the United States. This is all lies. And it was exposed by the Boston Globe, and the president of Mount Holyoke attacks the Boston Globe for divulging this. This is a terrible thing. Now, the students at Mount Holyoke have a strict honor code. They're kicked out if they're cheating, but the faculty seemingly can say whatever they want to say. Well, eventually, he was suspended for a year. Ellis was, and for that. And he's a great writer, but sometimes the story takes over instead of the actual facts. And he didn't want this to be a biography of Jefferson, so he left out certain areas. One was when he was in Secretary of State, and so it's technically not a biography because it got these gaps. And so what he does is he transfers material around to use it appropriately. So a letter from 1793, which I'll talk about, he moves to 1789, as if Jefferson is writing this from Paris. And so the letter is the famous Adam and Eve letter. Anyone know about the Adam and Eve letter? It's a letter that Jefferson gets from William Short, who, like a son to Jefferson, he was his private secretary in France. And when Jefferson comes back, Short eventually becomes charge d'affaires. He doesn't have the stature to be minister plenipotentiary to France or England. He would like to be. He thinks he should be, but he doesn't. He will eventually get assigned to Madrid and to the Hague. But at this time, he's at Paris. And Jefferson has experienced the beginnings of the French Revolution, was involved in it, was consulting with Lafayette and other leaders about what should be done. But now it's 1793, and Jefferson is still, not long, but he's still Secretary of State, and he has problems with Hamilton in the cabinet over the French Revolution, and he's getting these letters from Short in which he's explaining what's happening, the Reign of Terror. And finally he writes to Short, and he says, stop it. Don't send these letters anymore because they're operating against me and our foreign policy that we want and domestic policy. Hamilton is using these, so don't send these anymore. And in this letter, he explains, he says, sometimes guilty folks have been executed in France without a trial. And this is a terrible thing. Innocent people also, my friends, have been killed. That's just a dreadful thing. But I know that they would think that they have done great service as if they were soldiers in a great battle for freedom. And they would gladly have given their lives for such a thing. And then he goes on and he says the situation is so bad in Europe that it would be all right if all that was left was one Adam and one Eve in every country. And that was all, if we can get rid of the system that we have right now. Now, Pol Pot couldn't have said it any better, for complete extermination of the human race, except for one Adam and one Eve. Now, this is a total anomaly. Jefferson never says such a thing elsewhere. But this has become his cornerstone here with Joe Ellis. This is trying to explain Jefferson. Now, you got to understand, why is Jefferson saying this? Because he wants Short to stop and sending these terrible, terrible letters explaining the terrible things that are happening. But it's part and parcel of this extreme, fearful conditions going on. One of the things that is decided very early in the Washington administration, do we continue to pay off the debt that we owe to France? Jefferson wants to do so, and Hamilton doesn't want to. He wants to suspend this. The treaty, do we abide by the two treaties that we have, the 1778 treaties? One of the Treaty of Alliance is promises we'll support your islands if some other party wants to take them over. If England takes over the islands, are we going to go to war in favor of the French? The privateers that Sandy talked about yesterday. Are we going to allow French privateers to come in to our ports? And Todd is going to be talking about this with the Proclamation of Neutrality. So these are all issues, and what Hamilton eventually comes up with is reasons to either revoke the treaties or suspend them. And Jefferson has to respond, and the president has requested this in writing. And so he starts out by quoting what Hamilton says, and then he comes out, and it's about a 10-page report, he, in essence, says a treaty, he believes, is with a people, not with a government. It's the people that we have a connection to in France, not the government. And one of the things that Hamilton says is they're in a state of flux right now. We don't know what their government is going to be. We know it's not the government that we signed a treaty with, and we don't know what kind of government they're going to have. And therefore, we don't know whether we want to be connected with them, this new government. And so Jefferson sort of smashes that up, and he says, because Hamilton says it could be a despotic government, maybe not a monarchy, but an empire. Who knows? There might be, who knows, a Napoleon, perhaps. He doesn't say that, but that's what he's hinting at. And so Jefferson's response is, we were a republic when we signed a treaty with a despotic king. We knew he was the despotic king, and we signed it. And they're debating the kind of government, and we hope and we expect it'll be a republic. Why wouldn't we sign a treaty and keep a treaty with a republican form of government? That's what we want them to do. And so he goes on and he looks at the law of nations, and he says within the law of nations, it's the law of nature that we're talking about here. And then he looks at whether we should have alliances. We make an agreement, we've got a moral obligation. You and I both have to fulfill that. Same way with countries. And there are ways that we can get out of that moral agreement here. I can get out of it, not by just saying I want to get out of it. I have to have a reason, because you're untrustworthy. You have proven to me you're untrustworthy. That lets me get out of this arrangement here. And that's the way it is with countries as well. He's saying that people have consciences. Conscience is a big thing for Jefferson. And countries have consciences as well, and ought to abide by that. And so he goes on and explaining why we should maintain that relationship with the French. It is not a dangerous thing. It is not guaranteeing that we will go to war with England just because France is at war with England. There are mitigating circumstances here. And so you see the conflict that's there. Jefferson is quite happy when our relationship with the Spanish continues. I mean, one of the things is, should we accept the minister from France? Hamilton says, by accepting the minister from France, it's a de facto acknowledging the treaties are in effect. Jefferson says, there's no connection. The treaty has no connection with the minister. We accept the minister. That doesn't mean anything about the treaty whatsoever. And so Jefferson is successful in these regards. He says that the paying of the debt is my polar star. has always been to pay off that debt. Hamilton's not so crazy about paying off debts. He is developing additionally the commercial aspects of trade with other countries, particularly with France, very successful with Lafayette as his aide-de-camp, and more and more trade takes place. He writes a letter in which he says we should have dual citizenship. Let me read you what he says, if I can. I think I can read it here. This is the letter he writes to Gouverneur Morris, 30 December 1792. He's got one more year to serve as Secretary of State. The United States desires the closest union with France. Quote, mutual good offices, mutual affection, and similar principles of government seem to have destined the two peoples for the most intimate communion, and even for a complete exchange of citizenship among the individuals composing them. So he's advocating dual citizenship as Secretary of State, that Frenchmen will be Americans, Americans will be Frenchmen. Such a thing was advocated by Jay and Jefferson during the Confederation to apply to merchants and commercial activity. That is, all of the laws of each country would be applied equally to the merchants. There'd be no special distinction for a foreign merchant. But this is going even further than that. Now, the other major thing that Jefferson does, I think there are a number of smaller concerns, but Jefferson adopts the policy of recognizing governments in being. If a government is functioning, it deserves to be recognized, no matter what that government is. And he writes a couple letters. I've got a one quotation here. He writes one to Thomas Pinckney, who's our minister to Great Britain, and he writes that same letter to Gouverneur Morris, December 92. The one to Pinckney is a little bit longer. Let me read that one. He says, we certainly cannot deny to other nations that principle whereon our government is founded, that every nation has a right to govern itself internally under what forms it pleases, and to change these forms at its own will, and externally to transact business with other nations through whatever organ it chooses, whether that be a king, convention, assembly, committee, president, or whatever it be. The only thing essential is the will of the nation. Taking this as your polar star, he likes that term, you can hardly err. Now, in the letter to Gouverneur Morris, he ends, I want to get that principle recorded in the letter books of my office. That is, it should be the policy of the United States. We recognize every country once a government is going, no matter how it got there, whatever revolution. I mean, after all, we were a government of revolution. It presents a problem soon with Santo Domingo. Is not so willing to recognize slave uprising here and the killing of good white folks by slaves. That presents a problem to him. But it's the general principle of recognizing governments was there for a long time. We don't have that policy now. I mean, obviously, we had strained relations with lots of countries, particularly Cuba, for half a century. Jefferson would say, that should not be done. You should be understanding. Jefferson, although he was afflicted with a serious illness throughout his entire life, that is, he was a theoretical man, constantly theories. He needed, to a great extent, Madison as his, to use a term that Adams used, his ballast, or with Hamilton, his rudder. Hamilton's rudder was Washington. As long as Washington was there, Hamilton, some of his wild things didn't happen. But when Washington's gone, we see the prudence of Hamilton disappears, and he gets in trouble in the late 1790s. He publishes this pamphlet attacking President Adams. What a terrible thing. And he loses all credibility with Federalists. And it takes him a while to start getting back his leadership role. But it's suicidal what he did. And same with John Adams. He says, Abigail is my ballast. I need somebody there to keep my feet on the ground. And that was what Madison did to Jefferson to a great extent. Jefferson would propose ridiculous things. A new constitution every 20 years. Not going to work. And so Madison was sort of a tutor, a student under the mentorship of Jefferson at first, but it changed to a partnership. And so by this time, when Jefferson is in Paris, Madison has come up to the stature of Jefferson, and they're partners after that. But in the Secretary of State's position, the theory that often Jefferson would espouse for wild-eyed things, not there. He is realpolitik. He understands what diplomacy is all about, I think. And he does it from a very partisan point of view, to be sure. His translator, Philip Freneau, sets up a opposition newspaper to the government. And so you have political parties that are established. Todd might be talking about that. And Jefferson is a staunch opponent of political parties. And yet he and Madison, really it's Madison and John Beckley, that start the Jeffersonian, the Democratic Republican Party. But Jefferson becomes the titular leader of that. And Jefferson rationalizes political parties are terrible if they're out, as in England, to get money and power and position. But if the parties are there on the basis of principle, it would be immoral not to take a side. So there are times when political parties are indeed justifiable, even though you'll find a lot of references in Jefferson to the opposition to political parties. And he says there are political parties, I'll end on this, Tim is looking at the clock, I'll end on this. Jefferson says there always have been political parties in the world. Every single country has had political parties. Every single state has had political parties. They're not what political scientists today would term a political party, but in their judgment, they're political parties. And Jefferson says it doesn't matter what they're called, but one party fears the people, the other party fears government. And I think that was that relationship between Jefferson and Hamilton. Jefferson feared government, always had a fear of government, and had a sense of the perfectibility of human beings. Not that they're going to become perfect, but they can get better if they're given the opportunity. And so that's an important thing. Hamilton, on the other side, always feared the people and the danger that the people could be manipulated. Hamilton was a great orator in a small body. I don't know that it's ever recorded that he did well in a large body. But in a small body, in assembly, he was very, very good. Not fantastic, according to William Pierce and his notes of the convention, but pretty good orator. Jefferson is not a good orator at all. And in fact, as the president, he decides not to address Congress in person. And that stays until Woodrow Wilson, I believe, that starts that up again. And so these two men have different points of view. Jefferson is the eternal optimist. Adams is not the optimist. And I would say Hamilton is the pragmatist and believes that he can orchestrate. Of names, I'd like to come up with one word in my founders and the founders in that database that I have. Washington, I think I mentioned yesterday, was definitely duty. Adams was, what was the word? Vanity. What would Hamilton's word be? Miranda doesn't know this at all. Intrigue. Intrigue is Hamilton. If you look at his political career, intrigue all the way around. And sometimes that's good, sometimes it's not. Depends upon what side you happen to be on. But he, in in my analysis, I've never seen him say, I want to be president, but I know he wants to make the president. He wants to be the kingmaker. He wants to work behind the scenes. And so that's sort of the difference that's there. And these two men are thrust together in the cabinet, and they're working. Hamilton says this of Jefferson and Madison. He says, you know, we're all out for the same thing, but we have different ends, ways to get to that end. Hamilton writes this wonderful, and I will end with this here. He writes this wonderful letter in 1792 to Edward Carrington, a Virginian. He's now the marshal, the federal marshal in Virginia. And he says to him, I never would have taken this job, Secretary of the Treasury, if I felt I was losing my friend, James Madison. I needed him by my side. We worked together in the Constitutional Convention and the ratification debate. We talked about different things. We talked about the assumption of debt, and we kept it out of the Constitution because we knew how controversial it would be, but we do it statutorily. But how did I lose my Madison? It was when Jefferson came back from France. Jefferson lured Madison away, took him away from me. And Jefferson and Madison together have a womanish affection for France. Can't get much lower than that. Jefferson and Madison have a womanish aversion for reconciliation with Great Britain. And so Hamilton thought that these were dangerous things, that the interest of the country was in the opposite direction, was to have this closer relationship with Great Britain, absolutely necessary for the financial well-being of the country. And Jefferson had that opposite version. And we see this played out in the politics that evolve. And Todd is going to tell us about the two most important issues, I would say, of the day, the Proclamation of Neutrality and the Jay Treaty. So thank you so much for your attention.